I don't know why I thought it was a good idea to spend the weekend alone at the cabin. Maybe I wanted to clear my head, get away from the endless emails and noise of the city. The place had always been a family retreat, simple, old, and tucked deep into the woods. I used to go there with my parents when I was a kid. It had this charm back then, the kind of place where you could sit on the porch and lose track of time listening to the birds. But now, being here by myself, it felt different. Everything felt different. The cabin sat about 10 miles from the nearest town, hidden at the end of a dirt road that most people wouldn't even notice if they drove past. It was built in the 70s, a modest A-frame with dark wood siding and windows that overlooked the surrounding pines. It hadn't changed much since I was a kid. The same creaky floorboards, the same worn-out couch with the faded plaid pattern, and the same smell of pine and dust. I arrived just before sunset, parking my car next to the cabin. The woods were already growing dark, shadows stretching long across the ground. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the cool air, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. It was peaceful in a way, the kind of peaceful that made your skin crawl if you weren't used to it. Inside, the cabin felt cold. I dropped my bag on the floor and flicked on the lights. The bulbs buzzed softly, casting a dim yellow glow that barely reached the corners of the room. I turned on the old propane heater in the corner, the flame clicking to life and spreading warmth through the space. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The first night passed quietly. I made myself a simple dinner, canned soup and some crackers, then sat on the couch with a book. I kept glancing at the window, though half expecting to see something staring back at me, just the trees swaying in the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I went to bed early, wrapping myself in the thick quilt that had been there since I was a kid. The mattress was lumpy, and the sheets smelled faintly of mildew, but it was warm. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees and rattling the windows. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sounds of the forest. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves, felt magnified in the silence. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was still dark, the kind of dark that presses in on you, where you can't see your hand in front of your face. I lay there for a moment, trying to figure out what had woken me. The wind had stopped, and the cabin was deathly quiet. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic thumping. It sounded like it was coming from outside, near the back of the cabin. My heart started pounding in my chest. I told myself it was probably just a branch knocking against the side of the house, but something about the sound felt off. It was too steady, too deliberate. I got up, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the small bedroom. Everything looked normal. I walked to the window and peered out, shining the light into the trees. Nothing, just shadows and the faint outline of the woods. The thumping had stopped. I stood there for a long moment, my breath fogging up the glass. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. It was an old cabin, and old cabins made noise. I went back to bed, but it took a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, the sun was shining, and everything felt a little less eerie. I made coffee and stood on the porch, watching the light filter through the trees. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. For a moment, I felt silly for getting so worked up the night before. I decided to go for a walk, following the narrow trail that led down to the lake. It was a small, secluded spot about half a mile from the cabin, surrounded by tall pines and rocky shores. The water was still, reflecting the sky like a sheet of glass. I stood there for a while, skipping stones and listening to the distant call of a loon. On the way back, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt just off the trail. They weren't mine. They were larger, deeper, like someone had been walking through the woods with heavy boots. I followed them for a few yards, but they disappeared into the underbrush. I told myself it was probably a hunter or a hiker, even though I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. Still, it left me feeling uneasy. I headed back to the cabin, my pace a little quicker than before. That night, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees like a living thing. I locked the doors and windows, double-checking each one before settling in for the night. I tried to read, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the windows, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. Around midnight, I heard it again, the thumping. This time, it was louder, more insistent. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen. I grabbed the flashlight and crept down the hall, my heart pounding in my ears. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, the sound echoing in the silence. In the kitchen, everything looked normal. The thumping had stopped again. I stood there for a moment, listening, but all I could hear was the wind. Then I saw it. The back door was open, just a crack. I knew I had locked it. I was sure of it. My hand tightened around the flashlight, my knuckles turning white. I closed the door and locked it again, checking the latch twice. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with the flashlight in my lap, staring at the door. Every noise made me jump. Every creak of the floorboards set my nerves on edge. I kept telling myself that it was just the wind, that I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my bag and loaded it into the car, my eyes constantly scanning the woods. The feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. If anything, it had gotten worse. As I turned the key in the ignition, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, just barely visible through the trees. Tall, wearing dark clothing, motionless. Watching me, I didn't wait to see what they would do. I floored the gas, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the narrow road. My heart was racing, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my chest heaving, my pulse thundering in my ears. Even then, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me. I never went back to the cabin. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That I heard some noises and saw a figure in the woods? They'd think I was crazy. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that rhythmic thumping in my dreams. And every time, I wake up with the same feeling, that somewhere, out there in the dark, someone is still watching. I never expected to be stuck in that cabin for 5 days. It was supposed to be a weekend to reset my mind, a break from everything. I needed quiet. No phone calls, no emails, no city noise. Just me, some books, and the woods. The rental ad had been simple. Asterisk remote cabin.
No Wi-Fi.
No distractions. Asterisk it sounded perfect. The cabin was 3 hours from the city, tucked into a thick stretch of forest. I remember the road narrowing the closer I got. Asphalt gave way to gravel, then gravel to dirt. My car rattled with every bump, and tree branches scraped the sides like fingers dragging along metal. Felt like I was driving deeper into nowhere. By the time I reached the place, the sun was already low. The cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. It looked smaller than it had in the pictures, a squat structure with a tin roof and a porch that sagged just a bit in the middle.
No neighbors.
No passing cars, just the wind in the trees and the sound of my tires crunching on dead leaves. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me. Felt heavy, not bad, just dense, like the air itself was thicker out here. The front door stuck a little as I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled like old wood and dust. The floor creaked with every step. There wasn't much to it. One main room with a wood stove, a kitchen in the corner, and a small bedroom off to the side. A bathroom with a rusty sink and a toilet that flushed with a groan. Simple, but enough. I dropped my bag on the couch and stood there for a second, listening. The woods outside seemed even quieter now.
No birds.
No rustling leaves, just that thick, pressing silence. The first night was uneventful. I made some canned soup, lit a fire in the wood stove, and read until my eyes started to blur. I fell asleep on the couch, the book still open on my chest. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of something tapping on the window. It wasn't loud, just a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. At first, I thought it was a branch. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and looked toward the window. Nothing, just darkness. The tapping stopped. I waited a minute listening, but it didn't come back. I told myself it was probably just the wind and went back to sleep. The second day was colder. Gray clouds hung low, and the wind had a bite to it. I spent most of the morning chopping wood behind the cabin. It wasn't something I did often, but it felt good, physical. The axe was old but sharp, and the logs split cleanly with each swing. After a couple of hours, my arms were sore, and my breath hung in the air like smoke. By afternoon, the wind had picked up. I could hear it whistling through the trees, rattling the cabin's loose shutters. I stacked the wood by the porch, made another fire, and settled in for the evening. It was around dusk when I noticed the first strange thing. There was a pile of rocks just off the path that led to the woods. I hadn't seen it before. It was small, maybe a foot high, but carefully stacked like a cairn. I walked over to it, feeling a little uneasy. I stared at it for a long time, trying to remember if it had been there the day before. I didn't think so. It looked fresh. The stones were clean, not covered in moss or dirt like the others around the cabin. I kicked it over and went back inside. That night, the tapping came back. Louder this time. I shot up from the couch, heart pounding. The sound was coming from the same window as before, steady and deliberate.
Top, top, top.
I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and shined it toward the window. Nothing, just the empty porch and the dark woods beyond. I stood there for a while, light in hand, waiting for something to move. Didn't. I locked the door and went back to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. Every little creak and groan of the cabin set my nerves on edge. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, just the old wood settling. But it didn't help. By the third day, I was starting to feel it, the isolation. The quiet that had seemed peaceful at first was starting to press down on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was irrational, I knew that, but it was there all the same. I spent most of the day inside, pacing from room to room. I couldn't focus on anything. The book I'd been reading sat untouched on the table. The fire crackled in the stove, but it didn't feel warm. Late in the afternoon, I decided to go for a walk. Maybe some fresh air would clear my head. I followed the trail behind the cabin, the one that led deeper into the woods. The trees closed in around me, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky. The ground was soft and muddy under my boots. I didn't go far, maybe half a mile before I saw it. Another pile of rocks. This one was bigger, about waist high, and right in the middle of the trail. My stomach knotted. It looked just like the one near the cabin. Same clean stones, same careful stacking. I knocked it over with my foot and turned back, walking fast. My pulse thudded in my ears. Every snapping twig made me jump. By the time I got back to the cabin, it was almost dark. I locked the door, checked the windows, and threw more wood on the fire. I didn't bother with dinner. I wasn't hungry. I sat on the couch, flashlight in my lap, and waited. The tapping started again around midnight. This time, it wasn't just one window. It was all of them. A soft, deliberate tap, 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 moving from one side of the cabin to the other. I stood in the middle of the room, heart hammering, light sweeping across the windows. I couldn't see anything outside, just my own reflection staring back at me. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stood there for what felt like hours, barely breathing, waiting for it to start again. But it didn't. The fourth day was a blur. I barely remember it. I think I slept for a while, but it wasn't restful. Just a haze of half-dreams and shadows moving at the edges of my vision. I didn't go outside. I didn't eat. I just sat there, staring at the fire, waiting for night to fall. When it did, I was ready. I had the axe by the door and the flashlight in my hand. I wasn't gonna sit there and wait for it to happen again. If someone was out there messing with me, I was gonna catch them. The tapping started around 1 a.m. This time, I didn't hesitate. I yanked the door open and stepped onto the porch, flashlight sweeping across the trees. Nothing, just the wind and the dark. I walked around the cabin, heart pounding, the axe heavy in my hand. My breath came in quick, white puffs. The forest felt like it was closing in around me. Then I saw it, another pile of rocks, right at the edge of the clearing. I froze, flashlight beam shaking as it lit up the stones. They were still wet from the rain, glistening in the light, fresh. Someone had just stacked them. A branch snapped behind me. I spun around, light slicing through the darkness. Nothing, just trees. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with the axe across my lap, waiting for morning. On the fifth day, I left. I didn't bother packing. I just grabbed my keys and got the hell out of there. The road back to the city felt longer than it should have. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. I didn't stop until I was back in my apartment, doors locked, curtains drawn. I never found out who or what was out there. Maybe it was just some local messing with me. Maybe it was something else. I don't know. I don't want to know. All I know is I'm never going back to that cabin again. I never thought much of isolation until I stayed in that cabin. It wasn't my first choice for a weekend getaway, but I needed to clear my head. Work had been eating me alive, deadlines closing in like a storm, and my boss breathing down my neck every other day. I needed quiet, a place far away from the noise of the city and the weight of everyday life. A friend had recommended the cabin. Secluded, peaceful, nestled deep in the woods. "You'll love it," she'd said. "No cell service, no distractions. Just you and nature." Sounded perfect. I packed a bag with enough clothes for 3 nights, grabbed some food, and drove up early Friday morning. The drive took longer than I expected. After 2 hours on the highway, I hit the back roads, long stretches of gravel and dirt, winding deeper into the forest. Trees crowded the sides of the road, their bare branches almost scraping the sides of my car. The further I drove, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. No houses, no streetlights, not even another car. Just trees and shadows stretching in every direction. Eventually, I found the turnoff my friend had mentioned. A narrow, unmarked path almost hidden by the overgrowth. My tires crunched over the gravel as I followed the path, branches scraping against the windows like fingers. The cabin appeared at the end of the road, tucked between tall pines, its dark wooden exterior blending into the landscape. It was smaller than I expected, rustic with a steep roof and a wide porch. There was a shed off to the side, its door slightly ajar, and a stack of firewood neatly piled against the wall. It looked like something out of an old postcard, a little piece of solitude in the middle of nowhere. I killed the engine and stepped out. The air was cold, biting against my skin. I could hear the wind whispering through the trees, the distant creak of branches swaying. It was quiet, too quiet. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the smell of wood and old stone filling my nose. The cabin was simple: a single large room with a small kitchen on one side, a couch and a fireplace on the other. A narrow staircase led up to a loft with a bed and a small window overlooking the woods. Everything looked clean, but old, like it hadn't been used in years. I dropped my bag on the couch and wandered around, taking it all in. The silence pressed down on me, heavier than I expected. I tried turning on my phone, but there was no signal, not even a bar, just as my friend had promised. Felt strange, being so disconnected. I spent the first few hours settling in. I unpacked my bag, stacked some firewood by the hearth, and lit a fire. The warmth filled the cabin quickly, chasing away the chill that had settled in my bones. I opened a can of soup, ate it by the fire, and sat on the couch with a book, letting the silence wrap around me like a blanket. The first night was uneventful. I went to bed early, lulled to sleep by the crackling fire and the sound of the wind outside. But something woke me up in the middle of the night. At first, I couldn't place it. A soft, rhythmic sound, almost like footsteps. I lay still, holding my breath, listening. The sound came again, this time louder. Footsteps, definitely, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer maybe, or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. But the footsteps were heavy, too heavy for an animal. I got out of bed and crept to the window, careful not to make a sound. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light across the clearing. I scanned the tree line, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. The footsteps stopped. I stood there for what felt like forever, waiting, listening. The woods were silent again, the only sound the wind rustling through the branches. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. My mind playing tricks on me, maybe. I climbed back into bed and pulled the blanket up to my chin, but it took a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I stepped outside to find the ground around the cabin disturbed. Footprints, big ones, circling the cabin and leading back into the woods. I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. They weren't mine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a hiker had wandered through, got curious about the cabin, and left. It was a stretch, but it was better than the alternative. I spent most of the day on edge, constantly glancing over my shoulder, listening for anything out of the ordinary. By evening, I was exhausted. I made dinner, poured myself a glass of wine, and sat by the fire, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But the feeling never left. That night, the footsteps came back. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. Whoever or whatever it was didn't just circle the cabin. It stopped by the windows, pausing for long moments before moving on. I lay in bed, my heart hammering in my chest, my body frozen with fear. At one point, the footsteps stopped right outside the front door. I could hear breathing, slow and steady, just on the other side of the wood. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just lay there, waiting, praying it would go away. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, moving away from the cabin and back into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my bag, doused the fire, and locked the door behind me. I didn't care if it was just my imagination, if I was overreacting. Something was wrong, and I wasn't sticking around to find out what. The drive back was tense. Every shadow between the trees felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to stop. I didn't breathe easy until I hit the highway, the trees giving way to open fields and distant towns. When I finally got home, I locked all the doors and windows, drew the curtains, and sat on the couch in silence, trying to process what had happened. I never went back to that cabin. A few weeks later, I called my friend and told her what happened. She seemed surprised at first, but then her voice changed, soft, almost guilty. "I forgot to mention," she said. "The last person who stayed there left early, too." said they felt like someone was watching them. She laughed, like it was a joke. I didn't laugh back. I don't know who or what was out there in the woods that night. Maybe it was just a hiker, lost and curious. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear those footsteps in my dreams. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. And I wonder if they ever stopped. The rain started around noon, just as I reached the edge of Blackwood Forest. It wasn't heavy at first, just a steady drizzle that clung to my jacket and misted the windshield of my truck. I remember thinking it was peaceful in a way. The long drive, the gray skies, the sound of tires crunching over gravel. All of it felt like the kind of quiet weekend I needed. Life had been wearing me down lately, and this trip to the cabin was supposed to be a break. No people, no noise, no phone calls. Just me and the woods. The cabin was tucked deep in the forest, miles from the nearest paved road. It had belonged to my uncle, who passed away a few years back. No one had been up here since his death, but the family still kept it. I'd been there a few times as a kid, but those memories were hazy, just flashes of bonfires and the smell of pine. It was supposed to be simple. A weekend to clear my head, maybe do some hiking, drink a few beers, and sleep until noon. By the time I reached the cabin, the drizzle had turned into a cold, soaking rain. The air smelled like wet leaves and mud. I parked the truck a few feet from the front porch and sat there for a minute, listening to the rain hammering on the roof. The cabin looked exactly how I remembered it. Small, with dark wooden walls and a steep, moss-covered roof. The windows were dark, and the front door leaned slightly to one side, as if the whole structure was tired from holding itself up for so many years. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, jogged to the porch, and unlocked the door. The inside smelled like damp wood and stale air. I flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. Of course, no power. I'd expected that, though. My uncle had always used a generator for electricity, and it was probably out of fuel. I found an old kerosene lamp on a shelf near the door and lit it with the lighter I always carried in my pocket. The flame flickered to life, casting a soft yellow glow over the room. The cabin was small, just one large room with a bed pushed against the far wall, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a table with 2 chairs near the window. A door on the left led to a tiny bathroom. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but it was cozy in its own way. I set my bag on the bed and stood there for a moment, listening to the rain on the roof. It was the kind of quiet that you don't get in the city. No cars, no voices, no hum of electronics. Just the rain and the wind in the trees. I unpacked slowly, stacking canned food on the counter and tossing my clothes onto the bed. I found a box of matches and some firewood next to the stove and got a fire going. The cabin warmed up quickly, the heat chasing away the damp chill in the air. The rain didn't let up all afternoon. I sat by the fire, eating a can of chili and flipping through an old hunting magazine I found on the table. Outside, the trees swayed in the wind, their branches creaking and groaning. By nightfall, the rain had turned into a full-blown storm. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows and shaking the walls. The lamp flickered, its flame dancing with every gust of wind that seeped through the cracks in the cabin's walls. I should have felt relaxed, but something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a vague sense of unease that grew stronger as the night went on. It started with small things. A tapping sound at the window, faint but persistent. I told myself it was just a branch in the wind. Then there was the sound of footsteps on the porch, soft and deliberate. I stood up, my heart pounding. Probably just an animal, a raccoon or a deer maybe. I walked to the window and peered out into the darkness. The porch was empty. The woods beyond were a wall of black, the trees swaying in the storm. I locked the door, telling myself I was being paranoid. This was the middle of nowhere. There was no one out here but me. But the feeling didn't go away. I sat back down, my eyes darting to the window every few minutes. The fire crackled in the stove, but it didn't feel warm anymore. The cabin felt small, almost claustrophobic. The footsteps came again. This time they were louder, heavier. I grabbed the lamp and walked to the door, my pulse racing. I pressed my ear against the wood, holding my breath. Nothing, just the wind. I opened the door a crack and held the lamp up, its light barely piercing the darkness. The porch was empty. The steps were slick with rain, but there were no footprints. No sign that anyone or anything had been there. I closed the door and locked it again. I told myself it was just the storm playing tricks on me. The wind and rain could make all kinds of strange sounds. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an hour. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. I kept the lamp close, its flickering flame the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard something. Footsteps, breathing, the soft creak of the porch steps. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. I woke up to silence. The storm had stopped, and the cabin was dark and still. The lamp had gone out, leaving me in complete darkness. For a moment, I thought everything was fine, just a bad night. But then I heard it, a soft, deliberate scrape against the window. My blood ran cold. I sat up, my eyes straining in the darkness. The sound came again, slow and steady. Scrape, scrape, scrape. I grabbed the lamp and lit it with shaking hands. The flames sputtered to life, casting long shadows on the walls. I turned toward the window, my heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing there, just my reflection in the glass, pale and wide-eyed. I sat there, staring at the window, my mind racing. And then I saw it, a face in the glass. Not a face exactly, just the faint outline of one, barely visible in the reflection of the lamp's light. It was pressed against the window, watching me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The face didn't move. It just stared, its eyes dark and empty. I don't know how long I sat there, too scared to move. Minutes? Hours? And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat by the fire, clutching the lamp until the sun finally rose. When the light of day filled the cabin, it felt like a different place. Warmer, safer. The fear that had gripped me all night seemed almost silly in the daylight. Almost. I stepped outside, the ground soft and muddy beneath my boots. The air was crisp and clean, the storm long gone. I walked around the cabin, searching for any sign that someone had been there. There were no footprints, no marks on the window, nothing. But when I turned to head back inside, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The front door, which I had locked twice, was standing wide open. I left that morning, packing my things in a hurry and driving back down the muddy trail without looking back. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the storm and the darkness playing tricks on me. But I haven't been back to the cabin since, and I never will. I don't know what drew me to that cabin in the first place. It wasn't like I was desperate for some great escape or soul-searching adventure. I just needed to get away for a few days, clear my head, breathe some air that didn't smell like cigarette smoke and stale coffee from my office. It was late September, and the thought of spending a weekend alone in the woods seemed perfect, peaceful. I found the cabin online. It was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but it looked decent in the photos. Small, simple, just what I needed. The description promised seclusion, no neighbors for miles, and a little creek nearby for hiking. I liked the sound of that. The less noise, the better. The drive out there took longer than expected. The highway gave way to narrow back roads that twisted through dense woods. My GPS kept losing signal, and after a while, I had to rely on printed directions I'd scribbled down at the last minute. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already sinking behind the trees, casting long shadows across the clearing. The cabin looked older than I expected. It wasn't falling apart, but it had that weathered, forgotten look, like it had been sitting there for years without much care. The wood was dark and rough, the roof slightly sagging on one side. A small porch wrapped around the front, its railing missing a few spindles. I parked my car in the dirt driveway and stepped out, stretching my legs. The air was cool and smelled like damp leaves and pine. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing but the wind in the trees. No cars, no voices, no hum of distant machinery. Just silence. Perfect. I grabbed my bag from the trunk and walked up the steps to the porch. The door was unlocked, just like the owner said it would be. It creaked when I pushed it open, revealing a dim interior. The first thing that hit me was the smell, with smoke and something musty, like an old basement. The cabin was small, just one big room with a bed tucked into one corner, a wood stove in the center, and a tiny kitchen along the back wall. There was a single window above the sink, but it was so dirty it barely let any light through. A door near the stove led to what I assumed was the bathroom. I set my bag down on the bed and looked around. It was basic, but it would do. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. That was the whole point. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner, read for a while by the light of an old oil lamp I found on the shelf, and went to bed early. The mattress was lumpy, and the sheets smelled faintly of mildew, but I was too tired to care. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, heart pounding for no reason I could explain. The cabin was pitch black, the kind of darkness where you can't even see your hand in front of your face. I lay there for a while, listening. Nothing, just the wind outside, rustling the leaves. Eventually, my heartbeat slowed, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I felt silly for being spooked. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. After a quick breakfast, I decided to explore the area. The woods were dense and shadowy, even in the daylight. The trees grew close together, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out most of the sky. I followed a narrow trail that led away from the cabin, winding through the undergrowth. Every now and then, I'd hear a bird call or the rustle of something in the brush, but mostly it was just quiet. About a mile from the cabin, I found the creek the listing had mentioned. It was more of a trickle than a creek, barely knee-deep, but the water was clear and cold. I sat on a rock for a while, watching it bubble over the stones. Something about the stillness felt off. Not threatening exactly, just off. I brushed it aside, telling myself I was overthinking it. City life had made me paranoid. Out here, there was nothing to be afraid of. I spent the rest of the day hiking and chopping some firewood for the stove. By the time evening rolled around, I was feeling good. Tired, but in that satisfying way that comes from physical work. Dinner was canned soup and crackers. Simple, but it hit the spot. I lit the oil lamp again and settled into bed with my book. The cabin creaked and groaned around me as it cooled in the night air. Then I heard it, a faint sound outside, like footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, listening. It was probably an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon. I waited, straining to hear more. The footsteps came again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate, not the skittering of a small animal. I reached for the lamp, turning the flame down until the room was nearly dark. My pulse quickened as I crept to the window and peered out. Nothing, just the trees, their branches swaying in the wind. I stood there for a long time, watching, waiting. but the footsteps didn't come again. Eventually, I convinced myself I was imagining things. Cabin paranoia, I called it. Too much quiet can mess with your head. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept glancing at the woods, half expecting to see someone standing between the trees, watching me. By late afternoon, clouds had rolled in, turning the sky a dull gray. I decided to head back to the cabin early. The wind had picked up, and it carried a strange scent, earthy and metallic, like wet iron. When I reached the cabin, the door was open. I was sure I'd locked it. I stood there for a moment, heart hammering in my chest. The clearing was empty, the woods silent except for the wind. Slowly, I stepped inside. The cabin was just as I'd left it, except for the chair near the stove. It had been moved, turned to face the window. I hadn't done that. I scanned the room, looking for any sign that someone had been inside. Nothing seemed out of place, but the air felt heavy, charged. I locked the door and checked it twice. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every gust of wind sent my heart racing. I kept imagining that chair, turned to face the window. Someone had been watching. Someone had been inside. The next morning, I decided to leave. The peaceful weekend retreat had turned into something else entirely. Something I couldn't explain, but I knew I didn't want to stick around to find out more. I packed my bag and loaded it into the car. The cabin stood there, dark and silent, watching me. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A figure stood in the window just for a second. A tall man in a dark jacket watching me leave. When I turned back to look, he was gone. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway. I never went back to that cabin. I never even contacted the owner to tell them what happened. Some things are better left alone. All I know is this: someone was out there, someone who knew I was alone, and they were waiting. The first time I saw the cabin, it didn't strike me as anything special, just an old, weather-worn structure tucked into the woods. My friend Greg had mentioned it once or twice, calling it a perfect spot to unwind and get away from everything for a weekend. I hadn't been too enthusiastic, but I'd been feeling burned out lately. Work stress, long days, and the general grind of life getting to me. A few days off in the woods seemed like exactly what I needed. Greg's family owned the cabin, and from what I gathered, no one had used it in a while. He gave me a spare key and some vague directions, then told me to enjoy myself. I left early on a Friday morning, tossing a couple of duffel bags in the back of my truck. The plan was simple: 2 nights, just me, no phone, no emails. Maybe I'd read a book or hike around the woods, breathe some fresh air, and clear my head. The drive was uneventful, the kind of trip where the miles roll by without you noticing. As I left the main road and turned onto the gravel path that led to the cabin, the trees seemed to close in around me. The sun was still high, but the thick canopy of leaves cast deep shadows across the trail. The road was rough, potholes, loose rocks, and I had to slow down to a crawl. When I finally arrived, I parked the truck and sat for a moment, looking at the cabin. It was smaller than I'd expected, with a sagging roof and peeling paint. A stack of firewood leaned against one wall, half covered by a blue tarp that flapped in the breeze. The windows were dark, reflecting the trees behind me. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The main room was small but functional. A worn couch, a coffee table covered in water rings, and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A narrow hallway led to the kitchen and a single bedroom. Everything was coated in a fine layer of dust, but it felt solid enough. After unpacking my things, I opened a couple of windows to air the place out. The breeze that drifted in was cool and carried the scent of pine and earth. It felt good to be away from the noise of the city. No neighbors, no traffic, just the sound of birds and the rustling leaves. I spent the rest of the afternoon settling in. I found a stack of firewood in the back and brought some inside, just in case it got cold at night. The kitchen was stocked with the basics: cans of soup, pasta, instant coffee, and I had brought enough food to last the weekend. By the time the sun started to set, the cabin felt almost cozy. I made myself a quick dinner, then sat on the porch with a beer, watching the sky turn from orange to deep purple. The woods grew darker, and the sounds of the day faded into the quiet hum of insects and the occasional hoot of an owl. I went to bed early, feeling a little tired from the drive and the fresh air. The bedroom was small, just a bed and a dresser, but the mattress was surprisingly comfortable. I left the window open a crack, listening to the sounds of the forest as I drifted off to sleep. I woke up around 2 a.m., heart racing. I wasn't sure what had startled me. Maybe a dream, maybe a noise outside. I lay there in the dark, listening. The cabin was silent, but something felt off. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. I sat up in bed, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The moonlight streaming through the window cast long shadows across the floor. I listened again, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my own heartbeat. Then I heard it, a soft creak, like a footstep on an old floorboard, came from the front of the cabin, near the living room. My first thought was that it was an animal, a raccoon maybe, or a deer wandering too close. But another creak followed, then another, slow and deliberate. It sounded too heavy to be an animal. I slid out of bed, my bare feet barely making a sound on the wooden floor. I didn't have a weapon, just a pocket knife in my bag, which felt laughably small at the moment. I grabbed it anyway, gripping it tightly as I moved toward the bedroom door. The hallway was pitch black. I hadn't brought a flashlight, but I knew there was one in the kitchen drawer. I stepped carefully, trying to avoid the creaky spots in the floor. The house was so quiet that every step seemed deafening. When I reached the kitchen, I fumbled for the drawer, my fingers brushing against the flashlight. I switched it on, the beam cutting through the darkness. The living room was empty. The front door was still closed, the lock in place. I scanned the room, the beam of light flickering across the furniture. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stood there for a long time, listening. The creaks had stopped, but the silence felt wrong. Too heavy, too still. After a while, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Maybe the house was just settling, or maybe a branch had fallen on the roof. I locked the bedroom door when I went back to bed, just to be safe. The next morning, the cabin seemed almost cheerful in the daylight. I made coffee and sat on the porch, trying to laugh off the fear from the night before. It was ridiculous, really, getting spooked by a couple of noises. I decided to go for a hike, hoping the exercise would clear my head. The trail behind the cabin led deep into the woods, winding through dense thickets of pine and birch. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth. I walked for about an hour, following the trail as it curved around a small stream. I was starting to relax when I noticed something strange, a footprint in the mud. It was large, too large to be mine, and fresh. I stopped, staring at it. The tread was distinct, the kind you'd see on a heavy boot. My heart started to race again. Could have been a hiker, I told myself. Someone passing through. But I hadn't seen another soul since I got here. I looked around, suddenly feeling very exposed. The woods were silent, the trees pressing in on all sides. I turned back, walking quickly, trying to ignore the feeling of eyes on my back. When I got back to the cabin, I locked the door behind me and closed all the windows. My nerves were shot, and the cozy feeling of the cabin had vanished. I spent the rest of the day inside, jumping at every little noise. As the sun started to set, I found myself dreading the night. I double-checked the locks and pulled the curtains closed. Around midnight, it started again. The soft creak of footsteps outside the cabin. I sat on the couch, clutching the flashlight, listening as the footsteps circled the house. They were slow, deliberate, pausing every few steps. I turned off the flashlight, holding my breath. The footsteps stopped at the front door. There was a long pause, then a soft knock, 3 quick taps, barely more than a whisper. I didn't move. My heart was hammering in my chest, my mouth dry. The knock came again, louder this time. I gripped the knife, waiting. The knocking stopped. For what felt like an eternity, there was silence. Then, slowly, the footsteps started again, retreating into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. Whatever was out there, I didn't want to stick around and find out. I packed my bags in record time, tossing everything into the truck. As I pulled onto the gravel road, I glanced back at the cabin. It looked peaceful in the morning light, like nothing had happened. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, the trees fading into the distance behind me. I never told Greg what happened, and I sure as hell never went back to that cabin. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a quiet weekend. That was the plan. Just a simple trip to clear my head, maybe do some hiking, sleep in, and drink coffee on the porch while listening to the wind in the trees. That's what the ad promised. Asterisk secluded cabin. Peaceful. Great for solo retreats or writing escapes. Asterisk, it sounded perfect. Exactly what I needed. Work had been crushing me for months. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight. My apartment in the city felt claustrophobic. I figured some fresh air and solitude would do me good. I booked the cabin on impulse. 3 nights in the middle of nowhere. The drive up was longer than expected. My phone's GPS lost signal about halfway, and I had to rely on the printed directions the owner had emailed me. The 2-lane highway turned into a narrow gravel road that snaked through dense woods. There weren't any other cars, not even houses. Just trees, thick and dark, pressing in from both sides. I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods were swallowing me whole. After what felt like hours, the cabin finally came into view. A small, weathered structure sitting in a clearing at the end of a rutted dirt path. It looked older than I imagined, but it had charm. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and a stack of firewood leaned against the wall near the door. There was no one else around, just me and the trees. I parked, grabbed my duffel bag, and unlocked the front door with the key the owner left in the lockbox. The inside was basic but cozy. A worn leather couch, a stone fireplace, a little kitchen with a gas stove, and a single bedroom at the back.
No TV, no Wi-Fi.
Just a few old books on a shelf and a battery-operated radio on the counter. I liked it. Felt like stepping back in time. Simple, quiet. I unpacked, made some coffee, and stood on the porch, watching the woods. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the clearing. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was dead silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I should have felt relaxed. Instead, a strange tension settled in my chest. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, I wasn't used to being this far from civilization. It would take some getting used to. That first night was uneventful. I lit a fire, read a few pages of an old mystery novel I found on the shelf, and went to bed early. I slept deeply, the kind of sleep I hadn't had in months. The second day, I explored the surrounding woods. There was a faint trail leading away from the cabin, winding through the trees and up a hill. I followed it for a while, enjoying the crunch of leaves under my boots and the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy. About an hour in, I found a small clearing with a pile of stones in the center. It looked like some kind of marker, too deliberate to be natural. There were no signs or plaques, just the stones, stacked neatly in a rough pyramid shape. It gave me an odd feeling, like I was standing in a place I wasn't supposed to be. I headed back to the cabin, trying not to think too much about it. That night, things got strange. Started with a noise, just a faint tap 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 at the window. I was sitting on the couch, reading, when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just a branch in the wind. But when I looked outside, there was no wind. The trees stood perfectly still, their branches unmoving. The tapping continued. I told myself it was probably a bird or a squirrel, something harmless. Still, it unsettled me enough that I locked all the doors and windows before going to bed. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every little creak and groan of the cabin seemed amplified in the dark. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the tapping. But this time it was louder, more deliberate.
Top.
Tap. Asterisk, I sat up in bed, heart pounding. It was coming from the window next to the porch. I grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and crept to the front door. My breath caught in my throat. I shone the light through the window, sweeping it across the porch. Nothing, just the empty chairs and the stack of firewood. I stood there for a long time, waiting, listening. Eventually, the tapping stopped. I went back to bed, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, everything felt wrong. The air was heavy, almost oppressive. I tried to shake off the lingering anxiety by making breakfast and planning a hike, but I couldn't focus. As I stood on the porch, sipping my coffee, I noticed something strange. The stack of firewood had been moved. It wasn't a huge change, but it was noticeable. A few logs had been placed upright, standing on end in a neat little row. I hadn't done that. My first thought was animals, maybe a raccoon or a bear, but it didn't make sense. Why would an animal stack logs like that? I walked around the cabin, checking for signs of disturbance. There were no footprints, no claw marks, just the logs standing in their strange formation. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I stayed close to the cabin, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The woods felt different now, less like a peaceful retreat and more like a trap. That night, the tapping came back. It started around midnight, soft and rhythmic, like before.
Top.
Tap. Asterisk, but this time it didn't stop. I sat on the couch, gripping the flashlight, waiting for it to end. The sound seemed to move around the cabin, from the front window to the side, then to the back. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw on my jacket, grabbed my car keys, and stepped outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap. The woods were pitch black, the only light coming from the cabin windows. I swept the flashlight across the clearing, searching for any sign of movement. Nothing. I walked around the cabin, my boots crunching on the gravel. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was even worse. Then I saw it, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight. Footprints. They were in the dirt, just beyond the porch. Barefoot, human. They led from the edge of the woods to the cabin, circling it once before disappearing back into the trees. My blood ran cold. I wasn't alone. I rushed back inside, locked the door, and shoved a chair under the handle for good measure. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Who the hell was out there, and what did they want? I stayed up all night, sitting in the corner with my flashlight and a kitchen knife. The tapping didn't return, but the silence felt just as threatening. At first light, I packed my things and left. I didn't bother cleaning up or leaving a note for the owner. I just threw my bag in the car and got the hell out of there. As I drove down the gravel road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The cabin stood there, small and lonely in the clearing, fading into the distance. I never looked back. I don't know who or what was out there that weekend. I don't think I want to know. But one thing is certain. I won't be going back to that cabin. Not ever.